Maybe 2.5 years ago, I met a girl at a bar. She stood up and I stopped for the day. I didn't go there with the idea of scoring. I just want a few pints to help me relax. I had been there for about 45 minutes when the bartender gave me a note. It was from a girl sitting at the end of the bar. She asked me to sit at the table with her so we could talk. My curiosity was piqued, so I checked my rights and locked eyes with perhaps the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I think maybe I accidentally received this message. There was no way such a tough girl would care enough about me to make sure I pointed out that note and that mouth was made for me. Then I pointed at myself. To my surprise, she agreed. And that's where our evening began. I chose a quiet table in the corner and she sat with me. We introduced ourselves before moving on to small talk. Her name is Amber and she is 25 years old. Up close, she was even more beautiful. I asked her why she wrote that note. I'm really curious. Even though I'm not a pedestrian, I'm still not at his level. The possibility that I had been deceived occurred to me. So I asked if it was a joke, but she said no. This wasn't the first time my friends thought it was funny and a girl liked me. They taped letters to my windshield at least twice, claiming to be from a secret admirer. I have never fallen into the trap. I'm much smarter than they think. However, it was a real meeting. If so, I planned to play while getting to know each other. I continued playing for another hour until she asked me if I wanted to take her home. I hopped on and we walked a few blocks to my apartment. We had a few more drinks and started messing around. I don't kiss and tell, so I'll just say that we enjoyed each other's presence for the rest of the night. When I woke up the next morning, she was gone. I dismissed it as an unbelievable dream and went to sleep. As they walked out, a pair of beer bottles caught my eye. I moved closer to take a closer look. When I have lipstick residue on my mouth, I'm still not completely positive. I walked over to the bed and smelled the pillow in front of me. The wonderful scent took me back to the previous evening. There is no doubt that this did not happen. I was in heaven for a long time. I look forward to seeing her again. I went as far as asking some of the staff if they knew how to find her, but no one did. However, over time I saw it as a one-night stand. I started dating a new girl who was wonderful and fun to be around, but Amber remains at the forefront of my mind. This new relationship never really came to fruition. We ended our relationship a few months ago when we were newly single. I hope to be reunited with Amber and be able to pick up where we left off. I went back to the shop and asked again and received the same answer. I don't have money to hire detectives and I don't have them either. I can't search on the internet. Providence will come in the form of Craigslist. While browsing the website, I noticed the missing connection section. It seems as good as any other road, so I briefly described our night together and how we longed to see each other again. I posted it and moved on with my life. Everything was quiet until about the 8th day. A text message came from someone claiming to be Amber. I asked a few questions. They know all the answers and even add things that no one else would know. I was excited to talk to him again and asked if we could meet for a drink. She agreed and suggested a place where we first met. It seemed perfect, almost romantic. I'm starting to believe this could lead somewhere. My month-long search was over. For the rest of the week, my stomach was cramped. I count the hours. Saturday finally came and I got there. It was visible from the outside and was more beautiful than I remembered. I sat at the table with him, and the evening went like our first evening. Everything except one thing throughout the evening. She checked her phone many times. I guess she was just nervous and tried to ignore it. It was a little after 6, and she suggested we go back to her place. I've been looking forward to this for months. On my way out, I visited the bathroom. When I'm going out, I noticed she was playing with her phone again. However, she is on a call. I don't care. Also, maybe she's calling her roommate. She is a stranger to me. As far as I know, she still has children. I don't care. Anyway, she hung up when I got back and we picked her up outside in the car. I staggered across the street until she pointed to this simple 4-door sedan, and I headed toward the passenger door. She unlocked it and I fell into the chair. We locked the door, but instead of starting the car, she just sat there and smiled at me. She wants to kiss. That idea cheered me up. When I leaned down to kiss him, a strange male voice told me to stop. What? I was so drunk that it was difficult to assess the situation. I turned my head toward the back seat and saw a tall, masked man pointing a gun at me. "Don't make me shoot you, cowboy." Right away, I regained consciousness. I could tell he meant every word. I looked at the hamburger, our eyes met, and I knew I had been tricked. They are cold and without any empathy. I was exhausted. I lost the desire to live in the moment, to move forward much faster than I should have. I took my wallet out of my pocket and threw it in the back seat. I think my indifference caught the man off guard. He didn't say anything. Even when I got out of the car and slammed the door, I didn't know what to do. So I remained silent, looking out at the sidewalk. They were silent for about 30 seconds until I heard the car start and drive away. It didn't take long before I felt a rush of adrenaline. The weight of what had happened just before hit me like a truck. I bent down and started vomiting a large amount of wine and chips that came out of my intestines. I was finally exhausted and stood up. I leave my mouth and go home. I wanted nothing more than to sleep and didn't even bother taking off my clothes before going to bed. Most of the day was over when I wake up. I shared how alligators improved my hangover cure. The events of the previous night became clear at the moment. I felt stupid. All the time I wasted looking for her. Then, I became angry and my desire for revenge came out. A quick shower and a 2-mile walk later, I found myself filing a report in Chicago. Robberies don't usually attract much attention. When the detective gave me the photos, I feel like I've stumbled into something a little more serious. I was shocked to see the faces of Amber and her accomplice looking at me. I reported them. When the detective gave me the photos, I feel like I've stumbled into something a little more serious. I was shocked to see the faces of Amber and her accomplice looking at me. I reported them, and the detective told me the truth. Only then did I realize how lucky I was. According to you, I am the victim of a scam. Amber's real name is Shannon, and she used to be a professional con artist. The couple targets men who have been single for 6 months or more. I was said to be their 5th victim, and the previous 3 had been killed. And I felt the shudder pass through my body. The detective didn't know why being allowed to live had to do this to either of us. Perhaps our story caused me to take too many risks. Perhaps she was pressured by her partner. Maybe I will never know. It was hoped that I had new information to give him, but in the end I wasn't much help. We talked for a while longer before he took me home. Now it's even more confusing. I'm happy to be alive. On the other hand, I wonder why I was spared. I have a particularly funny theory that they don't consider $23 in a Max card worth killing. But the truth is that it's not a joke. Things became even more unclear when Amber's accomplice was arrested. He will be brought to court on unrelated charges with a lawyer as soon as he asks questions. Chances are he will still be a mother, even when faced with the possibility of execution. The detective assigned to my case, thanks to Amber, probably won't be caught for long. And even if she did, she would take the quiet route if and when caught. I hope I can spend a few minutes alone with her. Not because I want her to accept her role in the crime. Instead, I want to ask why I was spared while others were not. I'd like to think it's because we established some kind of connection on an emotional level. Then again, maybe it's just my romantic side, thinking honestly and honestly. Maybe it's not my time. This may seem strange to some, but I collect VHS movies. My collection currently has over 1,000 pieces and is growing every day. I spend my weekends searching thrift stores and online sellers for cool and hard-to-find cassettes. Sometimes I buy a box of cassette tapes. These are often personal recordings of forgotten television shows and family memories deemed unimportant. There was a time when I loved nothing more than cuddling and looking at them with my girlfriend. Although most are boring, now and then I come across something very special. A few years ago, I was browsing Craigslist and came across a box of cassette tapes. It took up a lot of space and they wanted to give it away for free to the first person to show up, so I jumped on it. An hour later, I was parked in front of the TV with a large box of tapes. The total is 44. Many individual recordings are blank or unlabeled. Too bad. I've always liked mysteries. And a few hours before work, watch a time-lapse video or two. The first season contains an episode of the original Battlestar Galactica, and the rest is blank. After finishing, I pushed the box into the closet and went to work. It would stay there for another 9 months, untouched and forgotten. In the meantime, I bought countless more cassettes and my collection began to take over my spare room. I made a giant shelf to store everything and took inventory of each tape as I showed it to them. That's how I remember the box in my closet. When I realized I hadn't watched every tape, I booked an evening with my girlfriend to watch it. I remember that night like it was yesterday. My friend Brittany arrived shortly after 7 p.m. We cooked dinner together and had Butterfinger ice cream for dessert. Around 9 o'clock, we curled up and started the first tape. Over the next few hours, we watch a primetime NBC clip from 1987. 3 HBO movies and a wedding from 1991. Brittany especially liked that one. The fourth tape is also a marriage. I watched as much as I could before choosing to pee and smoke. As I walked away, she was completely absorbed in the ceremony. After hitting my head, I snuck out onto the porch to smoke. It only takes 5 minutes. Before returning to the room, I got more water. I was doing that when I heard Brittany scream my name. I ran into the room as fast as I could. She put her hand over her mouth and her eyes were as big as saucers. His eyes seemed glued to the TV. I said I looked over at the TV but saw nothing but a blue screen. I asked him again. She was speechless but pressed the VCR rewind button. A few seconds later, she pressed play and tapped the spot next to her. I assumed this man was sitting down, so I did. The video once again depicts the happy couple getting ready to cut the cake. "I'm mad at you, what's wrong with you? Please wait a moment, it happened." The words were so sudden that I was startled. So I kept watching, waiting for something mysterious to happen. The couple was eating cake when the recording process stopped. The static allowed us to escape for a moment before starting a new recording. Now, a man is watching unless he looks at the starting video camera. When he moves away from the camera, a naked woman can be seen lying on the bed. The guy jumped on the bed and they started doing it. "Okay, baby," I joked. Brittany interrupted and told me to be quiet. At this point, I was completely stunned. I almost felt embarrassed looking at him. I never thought I was this kind of follower. The couple continued lovemaking when the woman whispered and strangled me. He did, and I started peeking and thinking, it's not about me, it's about each person. The man continued to strangle the woman. She started panting, but he didn't stop. Even as she grabbed his hand, he continued. He finished the performance and released her throat. A few of them stood quietly together for a while without saying anything. Suddenly, the man turned to the woman. He looked at her for a few seconds, then raised his eyebrows and began to shake her. The boys shouted her name and occasionally slapped her cheeks, but she did not move. That's when I started to understand. The man then stood up, grabbed his partner's shoulders, and shook her. Still no movement. That's when he began to understand, finally stopping and just staring into her empty eyes. "No way, man." Now I'm starting to panic. "No way, man." Brittany was silent. Man sitting on the edge of the bed. His head was buried in his hands. "Hello," we hear sobbing. This lasted for a while before he remembered the camera. And with one long movement, he reached out and hit it with his hand. The howl of static returned and I sat stunned. The whistling continued until Brittany finally pressed the stop button. "Man, what's the only word I can say? I've never seen anything like that before." Brittany turned to me and asked what we should do. Honestly, I have no idea. I still can't believe it's true. Maybe not. But let me smoke. I will consider our options. I retreated thinking that when I returned, I had proposed an idea that might be wrong. I don't want to go to the police until I'm sure it's true. I don't want to be the butt of budget scammers. Okay, if there were any doubts, she'd keep them to herself. Maybe she's still in shock. I know I was. Our evening has ended. I offered her to stay the night, but she refused. It's not serious. I won't be able to sleep until I know the truth. My first goal was to contact the previous owner of the tape. I know for certain that the man on the tape is not the person from whom I received the box. However, there was a high possibility that he already knew her identity. My email was not answered. I tried to contact them by phone, but their number is no longer working. Finally, I stopped by his house and discovered he had moved out completely. With no way to contact him, my options were limited to the police, as the police said they would watch the video and contact me if they had any further questions. Now it's out of my hands. During weeks of research, I rarely saw Brittany. She always made excuses. I think it's only a matter of time before she ends things. Another week would pass before she called. I can't do this anymore. I haven't slept in weeks. All I see is this dead woman. There's no point or sense in arguing with her. I wish her a good life, and it would be cruel to expect her to ignore such things. God knows I've had quite a few bad dreams in the past month. Things like this tend to affect women more than us. If his feelings change in the future, it won't be difficult to find me. Since then, hundreds of cassettes have passed through my hands. Space is currently scarce. I sold blank cassettes and extra copies of movies. Brittany is no longer in the picture. I admit that curling up in bed and watching tapes has lost some of its luster. Most of my viewing now takes place in the living room. Nowadays, every time I put an unlabeled tape into the player, I feel a bit scared. When I see someone die, I've had a lot of time to think about it. When you collect something that captures a moment, a part of someone's life, you never know what terrible secret he might discover. It was May of last year and I had just signed a lease on a new house. It turns out the refrigerator was not the subject of a deal. I will spend most of my money on the house, so I started looking for a cheap one at garage sales. I haven't found any way this way. Therefore, I miss Craigslist. After only 10 minutes, a person appeared not far from me. I called the number and a nice woman answered. She said the refrigerator was still for sale, but she couldn't guarantee it would still be there when I arrived. So against my better judgment, I asked him about PayPal and sent him $75. She sent me an email confirming that she had received the money and we set a date for me to pick it up. That Saturday, I texted him to let him know I was on my way. The house was a beautiful ranch-style house probably built in the 80s. I knocked on the door, and this hot girl with brown hair and a very short haircut answered. After choosing field work, I asked her about Sunny, and she said it was her and took me inside. I have no reason to worry. Just like the outside, the house is well finished and smells clean. We chatted for a few minutes until a tall guy, at least 6'5", covered in tattoos, appeared from the kitchen. She introduced me as John, her boyfriend, and told me he was going to take me to the refrigerator. She disappeared behind the house and I never saw her again. John led me through the kitchen to the garage door. He opened the door and pointed to the refrigerator. He was in front of me, almost sitting against the high door. I could barely see it because the garage was so dark. I asked him if he had a light, but he said it was broken and they hadn't had a chance to fix it. It's not serious. He had to open the high door so I couldn't get out. Anyway, I asked him to pick it up, but he said it was also broken. He apologized. I was just about to present it to the House of Commons. This upsets me, but I have no other choice, right now. There was a bit of light coming from inside the house. It must have done that. I took 2, maybe 3 steps into the garage before realizing there was plastic on the floor. I looked down and saw it covering the entire floor. That's when I started to worry. I don't see any reason why I should be there except that I would stop walking. John's shadow began to get closer. Then, in the left corner, I heard shuffling. Everything in me speaks of leaving. Suddenly I turned around and quickly went back to open the door. I was surprised that John was so close to me, but I continued. I snuck up to him and said, I left the stroller in the truck and I'll be right back. Not far away there was a cart leaning against the wall. He pointed at it and was about to say something, but I didn't stop. When I was sure he was no longer behind me, I ran the rest of the way to my truck door. I jumped in and out of there. I don't know what happened after that. I received a few messages from Dawn but posted them without reading them. When I got home, I logged on to Craigslist to report them. I was shocked to see that the list was gone. I looked around for another 30 minutes to make sure they deleted it immediately. I also called the police and reported it. They seemed a bit skeptical about my request but promised to check. I never heard from them again, and I didn't care. I'm alive, and that's enough for me. For the $75, I have no chance of asking for a refund, and it's not worth getting involved with these monsters anymore. Since then, I haven't gone there anymore. The whole system seems dangerous to me these days. Anyway, a week later I got lucky and a thrift store in my neighborhood had a used refrigerator. It cost $100, but it's much nicer than this one, and it serves its purpose very well. And in conclusion, I don't want to mislead people. I don't think Craigslist is dangerous, and it's free. Thousands of people collect their belongings every day without any problems. But after what happened to me, I don't think it's worth it. However, if you find anything on the site, just be careful. Bring a friend when picking them up if you can meet in a public place during the day. But more importantly, use your head, and the situation may seem fuzzy and could be the difference between life and death. A few years ago, I went hiking with my best friend in a remote area we'd never explored before. We loved discovering new trails, and this one was supposed to be particularly challenging. It was located in a dense forest far from any major roads, so we knew it would be the perfect adventure. We packed plenty of supplies, checked the weather, and set off early in the morning to make the most of the day. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from the nearest town. As we arrived, we were greeted by towering trees and a thick canopy that allowed only slivers of sunlight to pierce through. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but we were eager to get started. The first few miles were uneventful. We enjoyed the fresh air, the sound of birds chirping, and the serenity that only a deep forest can offer. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the trail became more difficult. The path narrowed, and the trees grew closer together. We had to climb over fallen logs and navigate through thick underbrush. Still, it was exciting, and we pressed on, confident we could handle anything the trail threw at us. After several hours of hiking, we reached a clearing. It was the perfect spot to rest and grab a quick snack. As we sat down on a fallen tree, we noticed something strange. In the middle of the clearing was a small, old cabin that wasn't marked on any of the maps we had studied. It looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind blew. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. We approached the cabin cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The air around it felt colder, almost unnaturally so, despite the warm afternoon sun. My friend suggested we just leave it alone, but I wanted to take a quick look inside. I pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly as if protesting our intrusion. Inside, the cabin was empty. No furniture, no belongings, just dust and cobwebs. However, there was something unsettling about the place. The walls were covered in strange symbols that looked hand-carved, and there were markings on the floor that resembled some kind of ritual circle. The atmosphere was heavy, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave immediately. My friend seemed to sense it too, because he quickly suggested we get back to the trail. We left the cabin and continued hiking, but something had shifted. The forest, which had once felt inviting, now seemed oppressive. The sounds of birds and insects had faded, and the woods felt unnervingly silent. We picked up the pace, wanting to put as much distance between us and that eerie cabin as possible. About an hour later, we reached a fork in the trail. One path led deeper into the forest, while the other was supposed to loop back toward the trailhead. We took the latter, wanting to head back. However, as we walked, things started to feel off. We should have been nearing familiar ground, but everything looked different. Landmarks we'd passed earlier were nowhere to be seen. It was as if we were walking in circles, but the path was leading us further into the wilderness. After what felt like hours, panic began to set in. My friend pulled out the map, but nothing made sense. We had been following the trail correctly, but somehow we were lost. The sun was starting to set, and the thought of being stranded in the woods overnight terrified us. We decided to backtrack, hoping to find the fork in the trail again, but no matter how far we walked, it never appeared. As darkness fell, we reluctantly set up camp in a small clearing. Neither of us spoke much, both too anxious about the situation. That night we barely slept. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was an overwhelming sense that something or someone was out there, lurking just beyond the trees. At first light, we packed up and continued trying to find our way back. Exhaustion was setting in, and our supplies were running low. We hiked for hours, but the trail never let us out. Just when we were beginning to lose hope, we stumbled upon a ranger's cabin that wasn't marked on the map either. Relief washed over us as we approached, but something was wrong. The cabin looked identical to the one we had found the day before. We couldn't believe it. How could we have ended up back here? We hadn't doubled back, we were certain of that. Panic gripped us, but there was no choice but to keep moving. We walked for what felt like another day, though we were no longer sure of time. Eventually, by sheer luck, we found our way back to the trailhead. When we finally emerged from the forest, exhausted and shaken, it felt surreal. We reported the strange experience to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. According to them, hikers occasionally got lost in those woods, but no one had ever reported anything unusual. Still, to this day, my friend and I can't explain what happened. We've both agreed never to return to that trail. I have always been fascinated by old, abandoned places, especially those with a story behind them. So when I heard about an old, run-down mansion on the outskirts of our town, I knew I had to check it out. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, and rumors about its dark past were enough to pique anyone's curiosity. Some said it was haunted, while others believed it had been the site of some terrible crime. Either way, I was determined to see it for myself. One late afternoon, I convinced a couple of my friends to join me. We packed flashlights, snacks, and a couple of beers, ready for a night of exploration. The mansion was about a 30-minute walk from the nearest road, hidden deep within a forest that had long since reclaimed the surrounding land. The path was overgrown, and the atmosphere was eerie even in the fading daylight. By the time we arrived, the sun was almost completely set, casting long shadows over the crumbling structure. The mansion stood tall and ominous, with ivy climbing its walls and windows boarded up or shattered. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as the wind blew through it. We cautiously made our way inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The interior was just as eerie as the outside, with dust coating every surface and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. It felt like no one had stepped foot in there for years. As we explored the ground floor, we found nothing out of the ordinary, just old, decaying furniture and a few forgotten belongings. But when we reached the basement, things took a turn. The air was damp and cold, and the darkness seemed to press in on us. Our flashlights flickered as we descended the creaky wooden stairs. At the bottom, we found what looked like an old storage room, with shelves lining the walls and broken crates scattered across the floor. In the far corner of the room, one of my friends noticed something odd. It looked like part of the wall was different, almost as if it had been patched up hastily. We walked over to investigate, and as we shone our lights on the wall, we realized that it wasn't just patched, it was a hidden door. My heart raced as we pried it open, revealing a small, dark passageway that led deeper into the house. Without thinking twice, we squeezed through the narrow opening, eager to see where it led. The passage was tight and uncomfortable, the air thick with dust. It eventually opened up into a hidden chamber, far beneath the mansion. What we found there chilled us to the bone. The room was filled with strange symbols painted on the walls, old candles that had long since burned out, and what appeared to be a makeshift altar in the center of the room. It looked like some kind of ritual had taken place there, and whatever it was, it hadn't been anything good. There were old, faded pictures pinned to the walls, pictures of people who looked terrified, as if they had been taken against their will. We stood there frozen, not knowing what to make of the scene in front of us. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time since we arrived, I felt genuinely scared. Just as we were about to leave, one of my friends stumbled over something on the floor. When we looked down, we realized it was a pile of bones, human bones. Panic set in, and we bolted from the room, scrambling back through the passageway and up the basement stairs as fast as we could. The house seemed even more menacing as we raced to the exit, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. We didn't stop running until we were out of the forest and back on the main road, gasping for breath. None of us spoke a word during the entire walk home, and to this day, we've never gone back to that mansion. Whatever had happened there, we wanted no part of it. The discovery still haunts me, and every time I pass by that part of town, I can't help but wonder what other dark secrets the mansion holds, buried beneath its crumbling walls. Last weekend, my wife, my son, and I went camping in the forest. Our son, who is only 6 years old, loves playing outside, and we thought it would be a great idea to let him experience the wilderness. The drive to the campsite was about 2 hours long, and we arrived just before sunset. We quickly set up our tent and started a small campfire. As we sat around the fire, my wife and I took turns telling stories to our son, who was absolutely thrilled by the adventure. As night descended, the forest became eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no other campers around, which gave the night an unsettling stillness. My wife and I both felt a bit uneasy, but we didn't want to show it in front of our son, who was still excited. We roasted marshmallows, trying to enjoy the peacefulness despite the growing tension in the air. Around midnight, we decided it was time to sleep. We put out the campfire and settled into our tent. My son, worn out from the day's excitement, fell asleep almost immediately. My wife and I, however, stayed awake for a little while, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was then that we heard something unusual, a deep growl, coming from the darkness outside our tent. It sounded like an animal, but we couldn't tell what kind it was. I quickly grabbed a flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The growling grew louder as I stepped outside. My wife stayed inside, holding our son close to keep him calm. I shone the flashlight into the surrounding trees, and to my shock, the light reflected off a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the bushes. My heart raced as I realized we were being watched by a wild animal. Without wasting any time, I retreated back into the tent and zipped it up. My wife, her voice trembling, asked what I had seen. I told her it was some sort of animal, but I couldn't identify it. We decided it was best to stay inside the tent and hope the creature would go away. The growling continued for what felt like hours, growing louder and more threatening. We sat in silence, too afraid to move or make a sound, waiting for the animal to leave. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the growling stopped. We waited in tense silence, not daring to move, trying to be sure that the animal was really gone. After a few minutes, I carefully unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest was dark and quiet again, with no sign of the glowing eyes or any movement. The creature had vanished. We were relieved, but the fear from the encounter lingered. Neither my wife nor I could sleep for the rest of the night, though our son slept peacefully, completely unaware of the danger that had lurked nearby. The next morning, we packed up our campsite and left as soon as we could. The experience left us shaken, and we knew we would be much more cautious the next time we decided to venture into the wild. As all of you know, life can be a struggle sometimes. Making ends meet isn't always as easy as just getting a job. Several years ago, I couldn't find work. It was rejection after rejection. At the time, nobody was really hiring, and the few places that were hiring were very competitive. I was barely making over minimum wage as a deli employee at a grocery store. I remember one night while I was working, I searched online for ways to make extra money and stumbled upon Craigslist. I had heard of Craigslist but had never explored it for myself. I found an ad for a freelance job as a secret shopper. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a secret shopper is, it's basically an anonymous customer who visits a store and asks the employees a series of questions. The employee is then graded on certain criteria, such as whether they make eye contact, greet the customer, give suggestions, offer to escort the customer, and provide a parting comment, etc. It seemed simple, but many companies, including the store I worked for, took these evaluations very seriously. Employees could be reprimanded or even fired for a poor secret shopper score. Since I had experience in the store and knew exactly what they were looking for, I thought this would be an easy way to earn some money on the side. The first store I visited was a local chain of grocery stores in my hometown. Oddly enough, it was the same company I worked for, but not the same location. As I started making my rounds, I noticed a man, probably in his 20s, stocking the shelves. He looked at me and immediately put his head back down, failing to greet me. Right away, he lost points. I approached him and asked where the canned tuna was. He never lifted his head from stocking the shelves and angrily replied, "It's halfway down. This guy lost points for not making eye contact and failing to offer assistance." Just for the record, I know how ridiculous all of this sounds, but these companies take it so seriously. They don't care if you're waiting on another customer. If you get a bad score, you're kind of screwed. I tried to give the guy a chance to redeem himself by telling him to have a good day, but he never did. Eventually, I had to initiate the parting remark, and that's when he finally looked up and said, "Yeah, you too." I noticed his name tag read Patrick and I smiled and walked away. However, I noticed that Patrick kept his eye on me. I felt as though he was watching me, and I started to think he was onto me. Maybe he realized I was a secret shopper. I intended to ask a few more employees questions, but I began to feel uncomfortable. Every time I looked up, I could see Patrick at the end of the aisle. It almost seemed like he was following me. I wasn't sure what his intentions were, but I didn't want to find out. I cashed out and passed my secret shop with flying colors. After I finished, I hurried to my car, eager to leave the store and be done with it. Once in the car, I began writing down the full report before driving off. I wanted to get all the information documented while it was still fresh in my mind. But while I was writing, I looked up and saw Patrick walking intensely through the parking lot. I ducked down a little, thankful that he didn't appear to notice me. He kept walking until he got to his car, which was a dark 4-door sedan, and he sped off. I waited a few minutes before I left. I don't know why, but this guy just gave me the creeps. I kept thinking, why was he following me around the store like that? It genuinely felt like he was, and it just felt weird. I'm a textbook overthinker, so I tried telling myself that maybe I was overthinking it, but something about him felt definitely off. That night, I went home and emailed my supervisor the report, and life went on. It only took a day or two for me to completely forget about that interaction. A few nights after I turned in the report, I was having a late-night dinner with my boyfriend. We were enjoying each other's company when our relaxing evening was interrupted by a loud, consistent banging on the front door. It wasn't just an aggressive knock, it sounded like someone was throwing their entire body weight against the door. You have no idea how horrifying it is to hear a knock at that hour, let alone a banging knock like this one. We looked out the window, and I was at a loss for words. It was that Patrick guy from the grocery store, and he looked horrible. His eyes appeared sunken in, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I called out, telling him to leave right now or I would call the police, but he didn't even flinch. He just kept banging and demanding that I let him enter the home. He repeatedly shouted that I ruined his life and that I needed to pay, there would be an eye for an eye. I remember him saying that, and I didn't even want to think about what he meant. During this interaction, my boyfriend called the police. They must have been nearby because the first squad car showed up in less than 2 minutes. It was a good thing too, because I don't know how much longer my door would have held up. Patrick was really throwing himself against it. The sight was surreal. A cop tackled Patrick right on my front steps and handcuffed him. While they were apprehending him, they found a knife concealed in his waistband, which was the most terrifying piece of information about the entire ordeal. I still can't stop thinking about what he intended to do with that knife if he had broken down the door. After he was arrested, I did get some closure on this nightmare. It turned out that Patrick was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Apparently, my visit to the store that day was what pushed him to his breaking point. He had been struggling to pay his bills, and from what I was told, his girlfriend had just broken up with him on the day of the secret shopping event. When I approached him in the store that day, he was only minutes away from the end of his shift and was mentally exhausted. I understood, we've all been there to a degree. Unfortunately, my asking for canned tuna was the last straw for him. He ended up losing his job because he failed another secret shopper report, including the one I submitted. The part one still can't figure out is how he found out where I lived. I don't think he followed me after my visit to the store, but there was no other way he would know where I lived. After that night, I stayed at my boyfriend's house and rarely returned to my old home alone. I don't know what happened to this guy, but I genuinely hope he figured things out. More importantly, I hope these stores get rid of the secret shopper program because it's just horrible. Last weekend, my family and I decided to go camping in the forest. Our 6-year-old son loves playing outside, so we thought it would be the perfect opportunity to let him experience nature up close. The drive to the campsite took about 2 hours, and we arrived just before sunset. After setting up our tent, we gathered around a small campfire. My wife and I took turns telling stories to entertain our son, who was thrilled by the adventure and the unfamiliar surroundings. As night fell, the forest grew quiet. The only sounds we could hear were the crackling of the campfire and the occasional rustling of leaves. We were deep in the woods with no other campers nearby, which made the silence feel even more intense. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances but tried to maintain a calm demeanor for our son's sake. We roasted marshmallows, enjoying the peaceful ambience of the forest night, despite the creeping feeling of isolation. By midnight, we decided to head to bed. We put out the fire, zipped up the tent, and laid down for the night. Our son fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from the day's activities. However, my wife and I remained awake for a while, listening to the gentle sounds of the forest. Suddenly, we heard an unsettling noise, a low, menacing growl coming from the darkness beyond the tent. It was clearly an animal, but we couldn't determine what kind. Without making any sudden movements, I quietly reached for the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The growling intensified as I stepped outside, making my heart race. My wife clutched our son, keeping him close and quiet. When I shone the flashlight toward the sound, the beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes peering at me from the bushes. Fear shot through me as I realized we were being watched by a large, wild animal. I immediately backed into the tent and zipped it up. My wife, her voice barely above a whisper, asked what I had seen. I explained that it was some sort of animal, but I couldn't be sure of its exact nature. We agreed to stay inside the tent and waited out, hoping that the creature would move on. The growling persisted, growing louder and closer. My wife and I sat frozen, listening intently, afraid to make a sound. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, but eventually the growling stopped. We waited in silence, unsure if the animal had truly left. After a long, tense moment, I cautiously unzipped the tent again and peeked outside. The glowing eyes were gone, and the forest had returned to its eerie quietness. Relieved but still on edge, we stayed awake for the rest of the night, unwilling to let our guard down. My son slept soundly, completely unaware of the danger that had been lurking just outside our tent. My wife and I, however, couldn't shake the fear that had gripped us during the encounter. We made it through the night, but the experience left us both shaken and more cautious about camping in such remote places. Last weekend, my wife, my son, and I decided to go camping in the forest. Our son, who is only 6 years old, absolutely loves playing outside, so we thought it would be a great idea to give him a taste of the wilderness. The drive to the campsite took about 2 hours, and we arrived just before sunset. We quickly set up our tent and prepared a small campfire. As the sun set, my wife and I took turns telling stories to our son, who was thrilled by the adventure. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. The only sounds we could hear were the crackling of the campfire and the occasional rustling of leaves. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no other campers nearby. My wife and I felt a bit uneasy, though we tried not to show it in front of our son. Despite the isolation, we enjoyed roasting marshmallows and soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. Around midnight, we decided it was time to go to sleep. We put out the campfire and settled into our tent. My son fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the day's excitement. My wife and I, however, lay awake for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the forest. It was then that we heard something strange, a low, growling sound coming from the darkness. It definitely sounded like an animal, but we couldn't tell what kind. Concerned, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. As the growling grew louder, my wife held our son close, trying to keep him calm in case he woke up. I stepped out of the tent and shone the flashlight around. The beam illuminated a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the bushes. My heart pounded as I realized we were being watched by something wild. Quickly retreating into the tent, I zipped it up as fast as I could. My wife asked in a whisper what I had seen. I told her it was an animal, but I wasn't sure what kind. We agreed to stay inside the tent and wait for the creature to leave. The growling continued for what felt like an eternity, getting closer with each passing moment. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the growling stopped. We waited a bit longer, holding our breath, unsure if it was truly gone. When we were convinced the animal had left, I cautiously unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest had returned to its eerie silence, with no sign of the creature. Though relieved, neither of us could fully relax after such a close encounter. We spent the rest of the night awake, listening intently for any more signs of movement. We eventually made it through the night, but the experience left us shaken. While my son remained blissfully unaware of the danger, my wife and I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had come to a potentially dangerous situation. Back when I was in university, I worked nights at a pub a few miles from my parents' house. We lived in the countryside, so I had to commute to nearby Leeds on weekday mornings. On weekends, I spent my nights earning much-needed beer money. After my late shifts at the pub, I had to walk about 2.5 miles along narrow, poorly lit country lanes to get home. Although there was a taxi service in the nearby village, it was usually fully booked on weekends, and I didn't want to spend my hard-earned wages on a ride. One of the great things about working in countryside pubs was the tips. Farm hands and landed gentry alike would always tip, no matter how small the order. Sometimes it was just 20 pence, but on lucky nights they'd leave 4 or 5 pounds, especially when they were feeling generous after a few drinks. My shifts usually ended around 11:30 p.m. After calling last orders, cleaning the bar, and sharing a drink with my coworkers, we'd leave around midnight to head home. One Saturday, after a particularly busy day due to a local garden festival, I'd made an impressive PS112 in tips. It was more money than I'd ever had at once, and I didn't want to waste any of it on a taxi. With a belly full of lager, I felt confident that the 2.5-mile walk home would be no problem. It was a dark night, with only a sliver of moonlight, but I didn't care. I had AC/DC blasting through my headphones, and life felt good. About a mile into my walk, I noticed the lights of a car coming up behind me. The car passed me slowly, and for a moment I thought the driver might ask for directions. But they didn't stop. The car continued down the road for about 200 yards before coming to a halt in the middle of the road. I stopped walking and stared at the car, waiting for it to move. A strange feeling crept over me, a tight sensation in my stomach, telling me something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally revved its engine and drove off into the night. I shrugged off the encounter thanks to the beer in my system. If I had been sober, I probably would have been more concerned. Not long after, I noticed another pair of headlights coming from the opposite direction. As the car approached, I realized it was the same one from earlier. This time my heart skipped a beat. The car passed me, only to stop again, this time just a few hundred yards ahead. Now I was sure something was wrong. I waited at the side of the road, expecting the driver to reverse and ask for directions, but instead, the car did a U-turn and switched off its headlights. It began creeping slowly toward me. Panic set in. This wasn't a lost driver, something far worse was happening. I started running, frantically searching for a gap in the hedgerows along the roadside where I could hide. Eventually I found one and scrambled over a dry stone wall, scraping my elbows in the process. I crouched behind the hedge, trying to stay out of sight. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but the light from the screen would give away my hiding spot. I threw it back in my bag and decided to rely on my ears. The night was eerily quiet. I strained to hear footsteps or the car's engine, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously peeked over the hedge, hoping the car had left. Just then, I heard the sound of car doors slamming, not just one, but two or three, all at once. My heart pounded in my chest. They hadn't driven off, they were out of the car, searching for me. I knew I had to move. I bolted across the field toward a small wooded area, running faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I was deep in the woods, where I crouched, hiding in the shadows and watching the field I had just crossed. After what felt like hours of waiting, I saw no signs of movement. I cautiously made my way through the woods, staying far from the road, until I finally reached my house. It was the middle of the night, but I didn't care. I woke my parents and told them everything that had happened. They called the police, who came by the next morning to take my statement. A month later, the police called back. The men in the car had been arrested for assaulting an elderly man in a nearby village. They were part of a gang from Leeds that would drive into the countryside at night, targeting people in areas with little to no CCTV coverage. Hearing this chilled me to the bone, but I was relieved they'd been caught. Since that night, I've stopped walking home alone after work. I always take a taxi now, and if I'm ever out late, I never wear noise-canceling headphones. You never know who's lurking out there in the dark, just waiting for an opportunity to strike. Last weekend, my wife, our 6-year-old son, and I decided to go camping in the forest. Our son loves playing outside, so we thought it would be a great opportunity to let him experience the wilderness firsthand. The drive to the campsite took about 2 hours, and we arrived just before sunset. We quickly set up our tent and started a small campfire. My wife and I took turns telling stories, and our son was absolutely thrilled by the adventure. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the campfire and the occasional rustling of leaves. We were deep in the woods with no other campers nearby. Though the solitude made my wife and me a bit uneasy, we didn't want to show it in front of our son. We roasted marshmallows and tried to enjoy the peaceful surroundings. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We put out the campfire and settled into our tent. Our son, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep almost instantly. My wife and I, however, lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. That's when we heard something strange, a low, growling noise coming from the darkness. It sounded like an animal, but we couldn't tell what kind. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent. As the growling grew louder, my wife held our son close, trying to keep him calm. I stepped outside and shone the flashlight around, scanning the area. To my horror, the beam revealed a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the bushes. My heart raced as I realized we were being watched by a wild animal. I quickly retreated into the tent and zipped it back up. My wife, her voice barely a whisper, asked what I had seen. I told her it was an animal, though I couldn't identify which kind. We agreed it was best to stay inside the tent and wait for the creature to leave. Sitting in tense silence, we listened as the growling seemed to get closer and closer. After what felt like hours, the growling finally stopped. We waited a bit longer to make sure the animal had truly gone before daring to peek outside. The forest was once again quiet and still. Relieved, we tried to get some sleep, though the experience left us too shaken to fully relax. A few years ago, when I was living in a university town, I had only one semester left, while my friends still had 2. To save money, I decided to rent a room in a house with two guys I found on Craigslist. I know that might seem odd, but that's not the strange part. One day I went for a run around the neighborhood and came back to the house. I decided to take a shower right away. While I had shampoo in my hair, I heard loud banging at the front door. At first I thought it was my two roommates, who were friends with each other, having friends come over. So I didn't worry much and continued showering. However, the banging didn't stop, it got louder and louder. Suddenly I heard a loud crash outside the bathroom. I grabbed a towel, intending to check what was happening, but before I could move, the bathroom door opened. Standing in the doorway was a man I had never seen before, staring at me. Another man quietly peeked around the corner from the hallway. The first man told me to get on the ground. I refused, not knowing how to safely get out of this terrifying situation. Then, I remembered my cell phone was in my bedroom. My only plan was to get out of the bathroom and grab my phone. I took a deep breath and tried to leave, but after that, my memory fades. The rest of what happened, I only know from what my roommates told me later. Thankfully, they were home. They rushed out of their rooms when they heard me screaming. When the intruders saw my roommates, they let go of me, looking angry and desperate. The men demanded, "Give us our money," my confused and scared roommates replied. "We don't have your money. We don't even know you." After a tense moment, the two men turned and left through the front door, slamming it behind them. That's where my memory starts again. I collapsed to the ground, crying uncontrollably, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. I lay face down on the floor, curled up in shock. Once I regained control of my body, I went to my room and called my mom. I could barely tell her what had occurred. By the time the police arrived, the men were long gone. The banging and crashing noises I'd heard earlier were from them kicking in the old 1920s-style door to get inside. The police arrived quickly, but when I told them what I remembered, it wasn't much. They did their best to help, but I was just one of many victims that day. It was the 50th home invasion they had responded to, and it wasn't even noon yet. Now, 10 years later, it's still hard for me to talk about what happened.